Okay, let's get started. I hope that you had a chance to work through and tackle the question of church and state and the separation of church and state. I think that's such an important question that I'm almost inclined to try and go through the handout and then come back to it and spend more time with it. But the one point that I want to make at first is that in the western part of the Roman Empire and the eastern part of the Roman Empire, there's different answers to this question. And it changes because if you remember, there's a singular event that changes, well, there's a number of them, but that changes the whole course of political authority in the Mediterranean. And that's when Constantine moves the capital to a new city. He moves it out of the Western Roman Empire and into the East. And the emperor, after that, will live, at least as a permanent resident, in the East. And so the West has a different relationship with that. It's sort of like the difference between living in Washington, D.C., where people feel a lot closer connection to the president, and people that live in rural Wyoming, and they're sort of like, well, the president can do whatever he wants and put it in his pipe and smoke it, and I don't care. I have cows to feed. And it's probably even a bit more analogous to something like Puerto Rico or some of the American territories where there's just so much distance between them that, like, Washington feels far away. So there's just a different relationship between church and state in East and West. And for history, this becomes very, very significant because the Pope basically has started to think of himself as boss, like Jesus entrusted the church to me. And in the East, the emperor thinks of himself as boss. Like, I'm the guy in charge, not the bishop. And that will have consequences. That thing continues on for some time. So the Council of Nicaea, we have to start with the problem of Arianism. And it's important to see how Christianity's relationship to the state doesn't spring up out of nowhere. It's not like someone comes by and drops a bomb in the middle of Roman paganism, and then there's this new relationship between church and state. Those kind of things, like, yes, theologically, religiously, it's a massive change. But that change, percolates gradually. It doesn't happen all of a sudden. And so, for instance, at this point, no one has really sat down to figure out what should be the relationship between church and state. That's not a question that they've asked, because in all of human history up to this point, church and state have almost always been fused. The leaders of the government are the leaders of religion. And that was especially true in the Roman Empire. Remember that all the political offices had religious positions. They were sort of ceremonial positions and, I don't know, like feathers and caps and gowns and that kind of stuff. But they had those positions, and some people took that very seriously. Some people thought that it was sort of funny and, mocked it, but some people took it very seriously. Like, that part, human nature is about the same as it was. So, what is the relationship between the emperor and the church? What is a good relationship? The best answer? They don't know. No one's asked that question yet, because the emperor for a long time wasn't part of the church at all. I mean, remember, up until the time of Constantine, even at the beginning of Arianism, it's around the 300s. The emperor is pagan, so it doesn't matter what the emperor thinks. He's not even part of the church. Who cares? But with Constantine, and then with the later emperors, as they become Christian, now all of a sudden, how does this work? The emperors used to be in charge of everything. Roman Roman political life was essentially a dictatorship. Not always in the negative sense of that word or in the pejorative sense that it has now, but it was like the emperor's will was law. They sort of kept the Senate around, and the Senate, they gave them the ability to do a few things, but if the emperor said boo, they all jumped. Maybe that's what I should tell Deacon. He should be scared in the sacristy when I scare him because I'm a priest, whether he's scared or not.
I am, Father.
But so this is a new thing. And popes have already, by this time, they see themselves as entrusted with the spiritual authority of the church. But what's going to become backwards or become very difficult is once the emperor leaves Italy, who's in charge of Italy? Like, who's going to make sure that the roads get built? Who's going to make sure that the stuff gets done? And the answer actually becomes the Pope, because all the politicians start fighting each other. Very, very shortly, there's all kinds of civil wars all the time, and they're always killing each other. The Pope's like, well, no one else is going to do it, so, if anything's going to get organized, it's going to be me. And some of that, again, isn't negative. That wasn't this instinct of corruption in the beginning, at least I don't think. One of the popes that's famous for this is Gregory the Great, who's at the end of the 500s, early 600s. But it's just sort of like there's no one else who has leadership, and so it falls to the church and her bishops to actually get things done, because the politicians are all, either whining about the emperor doing this and he's way far away, or chasing an army down to kill these people because they're coming down, they're breaking down the door. It's sort of like around a parish, if things need to get done and there's no one else to do them, it usually falls to the priest. And if that's vacuuming the church or shoveling the steps or, those kind of things, it's not that the priest should do all of that or that it's the most valuable thing, but it's like, well, it needs to be done. There's no one else to do it, then I guess it's me. Changing light bulbs, that kind of stuff. So, this conflict arises in Christianity, and we're going to see this pattern repeat again and again. So, the heresy that comes about is named Arianism. They say that Jesus is not God. Which, at first, you're like, wait a minute, we call Jesus, hopefully you're thinking, we call Jesus the Son of God. You think of the creed, God from God, light from light, those kind of things. All of that is a response to this heresy. But the pattern that repeats itself repeatedly in church history is that the person that's blamed usually is not as responsible as we'd like to think they are. So in the case of Arianism, Arius himself had some questions. Like, there's times where Jesus says he doesn't know something. Right? He says he doesn't know when the end of the world will be. And you can logically ask, well, how can that be if he's God? And it's not a real jump to say, well, maybe he isn't God. He talks at one point about, I will go to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. What does that mean? Like, Arianism was a response to some of these puzzling statements that Jesus makes. Now, Christianity ultimately decides differently, but there are good questions here, and there are puzzling things. And I would say for a lot of people today, the solution to them is just to sort of airbrush and turn it into a cartoon. Instead of seeing the details, it's sort of like a caricature. We just know these things. Well, how do we know them? Well, because it says so in the catechism. Well, how does that know them? Well, because it's the catechism, and the Pope says that it's the truth. End of story. Like, that's not a very good answer. Sometimes you have to wrestle with the questions. Like, it is puzzling when Jesus says he's going to my God and your God. What does that mean? There are times where there are real questions going on. And the debate that happens isn't necessarily bad. So the other thing is, how can you have more than one God thing? Right? Like, if you define God as infinite and eternal, there can be only one of them. Well, if you say that Jesus is God, it sure looks like you have two. And then neither would be God because you can't have two. You can only have one. And again, you hopefully can kind of feel how Christianity's response to this is to talk about three persons and one God, the Holy Trinity. All of that kind of language getting cemented is because of this debate around Arianism. So for Arius, he is a priest from Alexandria. He stresses the transcendence of God. He stresses this kind of unity, the eternality of God. And so there's not really room to have a second. So Jesus was not fully divine. His famous phrase, or at least what he's known for, is this phrase, there was a time when Jesus or the Son was not. And the difficulty is also that we don't have any of Arius's original writings. All of the writings that we have are people that didn't like him and thought that he was a heretic. And you wouldn't necessarily get a true story in the modern world if you ask someone who was way far right and you ask someone who was way far left. And we don't exactly know where the debate was, because we really only have the solution to it, that Christianity and bishops and saints ultimately marshal against this position, and slowly over the next about 150 years the church as a whole swings to it. But it's not easy and it's not pretty. There was a time when the majority of the bishops in the world were Arians. Whether the majority of Christian people were or not is up to debate, but there's a time where the majority of bishops are Arians. Sometimes we like to think that, well, there was this great central bastion of Christianity and these heresies were like little outward things. And it's like, nope, at this point they were the majority. If you had the majority rules, they would have declared that Jesus wasn't God. They tried to do that a number of times. So, there are different opinions. How do we use this language about Jesus? We call him Son of God. We call him Christ. Do we mean the same thing when we talk about God the Father? Do we mean the same thing when we talk about the Holy Spirit? How does that work? If we say that the Father is the origin of all things, then was there a time when the Son was not? Christianity answers that no. That's why we talk about the Son being begotten and the Holy Spirit proceeding. Those are actually very technical pieces of language that talk about something that is a logical relationship but isn't temporal. So it's something that you can conceive of, like Father and Son and Holy Spirit, and that relationship having some difference, but it's not a relationship that starts in time like parenthood does for us. So there was a time when you were not, when I was not. Before we were conceived, you didn't exist. You weren't there. Nope, you were nothing. Now that you're here, you don't disappear. In that sense, people aren't destroyed. We're created in such a way that you're sort of like a ray of light. Like once it leaves a point in time, you extend forever in the other direction, or in whatever direction. But there was a time before you existed. Well, again, when we're talking about Jesus, when we're talking about God as a Trinity, we have to be very careful, because the world that we live in, we can't conceive of it outside of space and time. It doesn't really work. This is actually a big part of the reason why when we talk about eternity and heaven, I think one of the best ways to think of it is a higher dimension. Because the relationship between space and time is different there than it is here. What it is, that's a ball of wax that you will spend the rest of your life working on, and you still won't know until you're dead. Sorry. But there's just a different relationship between space and time on the other side of death than there is on this side. So the bishops and Christians start writing letters to each other, and basically this war erupts. Who is Jesus? And this happens internationally. Christianity starts fracturing and dividing. The many heresies are a much larger problem in the East than they are in the West. But the one that's in the West, so the classic Western heresy is Pelagianism. This is American culture. I can do it on my own. I can be a good Christian. So Pelagianism is, I don't need grace. I don't need the help of God. You can do it yourself. That's the only major Western heresy. And that one afflicts us like a plague. It's all over American society because there's truth in it. There's always truth in the falsehoods that really take root. It's just not enough truth, like too little or too isolated. But it becomes much more of a war in the East than it is in the West. So what you should know is in the background of this. So 313 is the Edict of Milan. I think in 320, that's when Constantine moves the capital. But he's fighting a civil war, and he's occupied with a guy named Licinius, or Licinius, depending on how you pronounce it. So Constantine is the first one to reunite the whole empire. If you remember Diocletian, remember the guy? He split the empire into 4 parts. There's 2 emperors and 2 Caesars. And he's like, this is how we're going to rule this giant space. And then they're all like behaving like little 4-year-old boys. And they're like, I want what he has. So they go to war. Constantine reunites the empire. It's no longer 4 parts. But to do it, he's occupied. And he gets done with the war. And he is like, whew, back at my palace. And all the fighting is done. And then the Christians are like raging and burning down his city. And he's like, what are you doing? You know, military guy. So, you know, at home kind of fell apart while he was away on his adventure. He's like, we can't have this. So he decides to call a council because his concern is to preserve civil stability. If you have everything fall apart, it's not good. That's not helpful for what we're trying to accomplish. He doesn't, at first, have a whole lot of concern about the theological debate. He's not a theologian. But he does want the people to be united because unity is what he just spent like the last 10 years fighting for. He's like, I just won a war. What are you idiots doing? And so his initial position is, I don't care what you decide, but you all need to figure it out. So we're going to make you sit down and stare at each other until you decide. Do you think that's going to work? No. And so what he does at first is tries to promote a whole bunch of compromise positions. He's like, well, why can't we all just agree to get along? We'll kind of say something that's in the middle, and you guys can think about it this way, and you guys can think about it that way. And people like St. Athanasius from Alexandria are like, go to hell. Like, no, this is critical. If Jesus is not God, like the whole faith is screwed up. We cannot do this, cannot have this, no holds barred. So eventually, he decides that the best way to do this is to call a council of bishops. And so, remember that church and state thing? Constantine decides that he's going to call a council to sort out this church problem. Not the Pope at first. Now, the Pope's going to be like, well, you can't call it unless I say so. That's the way that Rome is going to start interpreting things. The East is going to be like, who cares about the Pope? The Emperor said to come, and he's got the army with the soldiers and the sword at my neck, so we're coming. Because when the Emperor calls a council, he, most of the time in history, sends out his army to make sure that you, the bishop, come. Whether you come on your own, or they arrest you and carry you in a body bag, you're coming. They usually started trying to be gentle, but sometimes they just arrest people and drag them there. So at first, it was planned for a town called Ancyra, but later gets moved to Nicaea, which is closer to Nicomedia. And Nicomedia, it was Diocletian's capital in the east. Constantinople isn't built all the way yet. The process is going on. They're making the new capital. But just like in the modern world, in the ancient world, even when the emperor says, I want you to build it, it don't just happen. You don't need permits and environmental reviews, but it takes a while to put all the stones there and make them work into a city. So the Council of Nicaea happens in 325. This is the first of the great ecumenical councils. These are very, very important ecclesiastical things in the life of the church. 300 bishops gather. They had an all-expense-paid vacation or arrest to Nicaea, which is, Constantinople is like on one side of the Straits of the Bosphorus. Nicaea is like right on the other side, like spitting distance. You can see it. It's very, very close to the imperial capital. Bishops have become important civil figures as well. So bishops that are close to the emperor are different than bishops that are, in rural Egypt, sort of thing. And now there's another nightmare. Because what language does the Roman Empire speak? Latin. What language was the New Testament written in? Greek. At this time, the people would have all said that Jesus probably spoke Greek, because that's what the New Testament said he spoke. Now, he probably did know some Greek because of the area that he lived in. Just on a natural level, Jesus very likely knew Aramaic and Hebrew and Greek. He probably wasn't familiar with Latin, but we don't know exactly. He may have been a very smart guy. May have picked up languages very, very quickly. So Constantine calls this thing, they have to decide first, are we going to debate in Latin or Greek? And that becomes singly important, because if you're a bishop from the West, what language do you likely speak? Latin. And if you're a bishop from the East, you probably speak Greek, and they don't always know each other's language. So if you are doing something in Latin or Greek, you could get very different. And there's also, languages embody a perspective. Like, language comes with a perspective on the world. This is so fantastically important when you're thinking about languages that you just have to remember it. Languages have ways of talking about things that are different. So English is a very functionalistic language. It's not a bad thing, but English naturally lends itself to subject, verb, object. Like, I did this. And it's almost always in that order. Word order in English is very, very important. If you start getting to French and Spanish and other languages that are closely related to us, you get a different perspective on the world. They say things differently. They'll be like, oh, this was done to me. Like, so in English, we say, I am hungry, state of being. In most languages, they say, I have hunger. That it's just a part of you. And there's all kinds of things like this. It becomes even stickier in theology, because that perspective of the language gets embodied in how you relate to everything. And if you remember, Greek is the language of poets and playwrights. Latin is the language of engineering geniuses and lawyers. Do you think they're going to have different perspectives? So, if you're having a debate between a lawyer and a poet, or a lawyer and a painter, is that a very easy thing to debate? Not usually, because they just look at the world differently. Even if they end up agreeing on what is actually going on, the perspective is different. Do you see how this is going to set up some things? So at Nicaea, it was less of an issue, but as the empire gets more and more divided, as the Easterns start drifting away from the Westerns politically, those linguistic differences become more and more pronounced and more important. It gets even crazier when you start throwing in stuff like Syriac and Egyptian and Coptic and all these other ones, but that's a little bit beyond this. The biblical text has places where it's ambiguous. Like Jesus says he can learn. It talks about him going back to Nazareth and growing in wisdom. How can God grow in wisdom if he knows everything already? That doesn't make sense. My hope is that you start to see that there's a way that we answer this as Christians, but there's actually puzzles in the scripture that are real, and they're there, and they are hard to make sense of. And that's okay. Like, we just have to admit that. So they decide that Jesus is of the same substance of the Father. Remember when the Creed changed a few years ago? We talk about the Son consubstantial with the Father, and that was kind of a big deal that they wanted that word back in there. That's this debate. 325, 1700 years ago. This debate is why that word is in there. That's why it was important, because this was decided, like, this is the faith of the church. This is the faith of the creed. So they end up writing a creed. The creed that we say at Mass now isn't just from this council. This was the beginning of it, but it combined some stuff that was added and some things that were taken out in a council in 381 called the Council of Constantinople. So they decide that Jesus is of the same substance of the Father. He's the same kind of thing. If Father's God, Jesus is God, they're the same sort of thing. One divine nature. That's their conclusion. So they reject Arianism. Just because the council does it, does that mean everyone's going to listen to them? No. No. They won't listen to them for like 150 years. It takes a long time for this to filter through. They also include a set of anathemas. These are condemnations of contrary positions. And then they have a debate about Easter. When do you set the date of Easter? And eventually, I don't know how early it is. If it's here, they decide. But the modern formula that we use is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So it's always a Sunday, there's always a full moon in the vicinity, and it's always after the spring equinox because they wanted it to stay at the same time of the year every year. Because if you just do lunar months, it moves gradually. So you'd eventually have Easter in the middle of December because of the relationship between lunar stuff and solar stuff. So the great hero of the council for the Catholics is Saint Athanasius, who is a saint. We've encountered him before. He's from Alexandria in Egypt. He's the one that writes the history of St. Anthony of the Desert, that Athanasius. He's a very strong defender of what's called Nicene Orthodoxy. Jesus is God. Arius is wrong. Remember, Arius was from Alexandria. So eventually Athanasius becomes a bishop. But Arius himself wasn't quite as crazy as he's made out to be. Some other people that are important are Saints Basil and Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory Nazianzen. They're three friends. They're called the Cappadocian Fathers. They also defend Nicene Orthodoxy. But a good point is that they actually preferred a language. They preferred a slightly different term. So the term that the council uses is homoousios, H-O-M-O, of the same substance. They preferred the term homoiousios, that iota, means of a like substance. And what eventually happens, the short answer is that eventually a reconciliation, a compromise position is adopted between the people that are like of the same substance and of a like substance, that these meanings are close enough that we can share communion. Like this position can be orthodox. The people that say Jesus is not of the same substance, those are the ones that are out. Those are the heretics. So eventually they do adopt a compromise position. But it's a compromise where it's like we're trying to say the same thing. Because again, how could you have more than one God thing? That's very, very uncomfortable in Greek. You can't do it very easily in Greek. It's not as uncomfortable in Latin. Like the way that Latin conceives of God and the language that Latin uses about God is different enough from the Greek that this problem that's in Greek, the difference between of the same substance and of a like substance, kind of doesn't exist in Latin. They're like, oh, we're all saying the same thing. Look, you translate that word the same way we translate this word. So again, that linguistic thing is in the background. So the West is much more united behind the Pope. The Pope is like, okay, the council decided, I formally decree Jesus is the Son of God, end of story. No more problems. Again, sadly, it doesn't work that way. So what happens in history is really, really odd because the Germanic peoples, so the Roman Empire itself is officially Nicene Orthodoxy. Jesus is the Son of God, same substance. All of the Germanic tribes to the north and peoples to the south, and even some of the people to the east, adopt Arian Christianity. Now, is Arian Christianity better than paganism? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because for the most part, they do the same things, they look the same, they celebrate Easter, they still kind of worship Jesus, they just have him in a slightly different position than God the Father. But it is sort of funny that this is going to become a tension because like when the Germanic tribes invade south, they're not just invaders, they also have theological differences, and so they're going to take the churches and put their own priests and their own bishops in who are Arians and kick out the Orthodox Catholics. So the West is more united. The East is in an uproar. That's where Arius lived. There's debates. Bishops are on both sides. And this is also one of the cases that's very, very odd. So the Bishop of Constantinople would be like the sort of second in command after the emperor, like Emperor, Bishop of Constantinople. Many bishops of Constantinople are heretics that are later condemned by councils. It never happens to the Pope. So the Romans are like, look, infallibility. You see this. There's never been a papal heretic. And in the East, they're like, we've had lots of them. That's why we don't trust them. So the battle rages for some time. It's not exactly sorted out, and it becomes political. And there's tension in the empire because the Sassanid Empire is in the east, modern-day Persia and Iran. They're pushing westward into the Roman Empire in Mesopotamia and Syria. The Germanic tribes are pushing south from north of the Alps into Italy and France and Spain. They're attacking. So there's lots of wars around the border. The unity that was before is starting to break down. So eventually in 381, the emperor is like, okay, this isn't working. You guys didn't listen. You're not listening to the council. We need to have another one. So he calls another council. This is Theodosius.